There are some problems that are difficult problems, but worthy problems to solve. There's not many people in the world who would be able to solve this really well. And I don't know if I can or cannot solve these, but this is time well spent in my life, right? If I can get somewhat closer, if I can get a coalition of minds to be able to solve some of these big problems, if I can influence a generation of team members to think about this and go away and then maybe work at other companies and kind of lay seeds, that feels like success to me.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 49 of the Say Again podcast with me, Amrita Tripathi. I'm beyond happy today to be in conversation with senior global leader Maya Hari. She's a co-founder of Genie Health, the former CEO of Terrascope, which was working on climate tech earlier, Maya. And of course, you're someone who's worked at Twitter, Google, Microsoft, Cisco, and Samsung. Thank you so much for taking the time out today.
No, an absolute pleasure. As been someone who's worked together with you, Amrita, it's absolutely lovely and a privilege to come back onto your podcast.
It's fantastic to also see your journey, Maya. I'm looking forward to learning more about, since our paths diverged, what you've been up to. You're joining us from Singapore. And, as I was saying, you really feel like a true global leader. I want to ask you a little bit over the course of this conversation, what that means, especially at a time that seems very complicated for a lot of people. But let's start by talking about the rise of AI, right? Of course, we're seeing the proliferation of LLMs. Gen AI has taken over the world with so many different interesting use cases. And we just had someone on talking about, the possibility of AGI, artificial general intelligence by 2030, what that might mean. How do you perceive this? And as someone who's really working at that intersection of tech and impact, what is your take right now?
Listen, I have to tell you, I started my career at the dot-com bust. And I heard all these stories about how the dot-com boom was like the best thing that ever happened. It was the most exciting time in technology. And I'll tell you, all these years later, there's almost a full circle moment for me in looking at kind of what AI is served up on a platter for the world to consider. It's both the most exciting moment in technology in all of my career, seeing the possibility of what's ahead for us, but also the most terrifying moment of potentially losing control of really the way of life that humanity has seen so far. But there is the thrill of living in that duality of sort of wanting more and wanting to be in that world, as well as kind of thinking really carefully about how to avoid some of the things that might go wrong.
And, we're living in a time, alluding to being complicated. We have folks like Christian Amanpour saying there's no world order anymore. Certainly, it's a shift from what came before. And I just spoke to Aki Ranin, who is a founder and investor. He was talking about the rise of techno-capitalism. With folks who are working increasingly, and you've worked in huge companies as well as startups, especially people who are trying to navigate these kind of global forces, global markets. What are some things you think we need to keep in mind right now, especially given what you just said? Things are just changing so fast.
Yeah, I think the really interesting part is that we just have to accept that the world order from a geopolitical lens is changing, but has changed, right? And there's a lot of really interesting kind of commentary talking about how there was this world order set up post World War II that needed to serve the needs of the day and build alliances and build trade alliances and things like that. And that sort of changed completely. I sort of see it as a one-way change towards building a completely new world order. Now, who is a coalition? Is there coalitions? How do you actually see that through? It's going to take a few years to play out, but it's complicated, right? And then that leads to a lot of nationalism and a lot of looking within geographic boundaries. So that's happening on one side. On the other side, you have kind of a further deepening of this few large companies that control, in a way, the ability for consumers to spend time to interact with each other, and use of consumer data in ways that is put to good use, but also has some complicated consequences sometimes. And you're just seeing another sort of a whole new level of that playing out, where there is a unification of point of view globally through the use of technology. And it's both a good thing and it's mostly a good thing in a way, if I think about it, where the rest of the world is so divided. You have a fairly unifying force in technology that is the same platforms, the same kind of ability to transition how humans are operating and how we're working and how effective we are into a new way of working. So at least we have this common language and common thread. It used to be that the last wave of that was social media, going back to the company that we both worked at and the space that we both worked at. Everybody was consuming content very similarly. Our patterns were similar. And so even if a teenager in India, talked to a teenager in Singapore or talked to a teenager in the US, that was their common language and their connecting bond. Today, the use of AI is the connecting bond. It's the thing that we all do similarly and we unify. So that, I think, is the interesting moment of unification in a very highly fragmented reality, where this poses some interesting questions for governments and for large corporate leaders to think about, is how do you navigate these two issues very differently? On one side, you have to think very carefully about domestic approaches to building business. Every country needs a unique approach. You need to be thinking carefully about that. But then on the other hand, how you build technology, how you build products is even more potentially globalized with a single platform than ever before. So it poses, interesting opportunities, I think, but needs fresh thinking for this world. The existing way of thinking and operating is going to start to look a little stale for this reality.
Yeah. Well, my dog agrees with you. Sorry.
Yeah, he or she would like to be on the podcast.
She's like, yes, fresh thinking, please. Just sort of jokes apart. But we've been talking about sort of this tech bro culture, right? Like Silicon Valley, and it is actually like a handful of corporations who will decide what the next
Yes.
avatar of all of this is. But I did want to ask you, because you're like one of our leading women from STEM. You were an engineer. You were in these leadership positions in these huge companies, becoming a CEO. So just as a bit of a joke, Maya, what is that version of a tech bro? I was like, Maya, what do I call you? I can't call you a tech bro, but you're like we don't have a word.
Tech chick? Can we call
Yeah.
you tech chick? Sounds nicer than tech bro
Yeah,
these
it
days.
does. But there's so few that I think it's not even in common parlance, But you're like a techie. And I feel like you have been interested, of course, since the start of your career in sort of technology. Will you tell me a little bit about your newest venture? I just saw that post where you said you're incubating Genie Health. It's in the space of AI and health, and you're a co-founder. Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah. Well, actually, the last few months have been very interesting thought process about some large problems that impact all of us as human beings. That this set of co-founders, we got together and we said we'd love to build something that's meaningful. And we said, what more should we think about, or what better should we think about than health and longevity and how we actually maximize our own well-being? And it's not just about living longer; it's about actually living happier, living healthier, but actually being able to not be victims to our health as we age, but being able to be proactive and take control of what our life goals are and what our health should look like. So Genie is actually a AI-powered health guide to help the members and users of Genie to become the healthiest versions of themselves, in a nutshell. But the how we do this is we want to actually be able to bring the power of AI to put the control of what the health data and the lifestyle data looks like back in the hands of the consumer, not necessarily always in the case of the health provider, but also be able to bring the ability for health experts and for consumers to be able to see the data and be able to use insights to provide smarter care to the consumers. So in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to build. There's an interesting why now moment to build such a platform, right? And there's actually two why now moments. We see in many countries around the world, there's political will and there's governments with the will to actually bring consolidation of all the consumers and citizens' health data in one place. So that's a really good starting point for a technology company to say, okay, great. There's already this ability or this intent or will to digitize and bring it together. So that's really interesting. And the second is that we're in the age of AI, where even if we do consolidate the data in one place, what can we do with it, right? And the ability to interpret that, the ability to add positive nudges to a consumer, be able to help them take control of their health journey and plan their health is actually much easier with generative AI than without. It would just take a lot more humans, a lot more effort to personalize a health journey for a consumer. But we have a lot more visibility and ability to compute that in real time. So that's the exciting moment of why today is the moment we thought about Genie. Interestingly, one of the co-founders and I talked about such a concept of a health locker that could consolidate all the consumers' data about 7 or 8 years ago first.
Wow.
And it was because we were thinking, oh, there's the age of blockchain. Maybe it'll become easier because there's blockchain, and we could create a vault and we could do all of that. And we had some tailwinds, but we didn't quite feel like all of the pieces were there, including regulatory will. And fast forward 8 years, it feels like a very different environment, and the feasibility of building something to fruition looks far more interesting. So that's what we're up to.
That's so interesting. I will come back to this because I feel like for startups, that's something we don't hear about enough, right? Which is the timing. You also have to have the right, like you said, the momentum behind you. So this is one huge area that seems to be that's only going to pick up in terms of interest as well. You've also just been CEO of Terrascope, which was in the space of climate tech. So you're not choosing small problems. Firstly, let's point out.
Come on. What is the good use of time is always a
Exactly.
question I ask myself. And a good use of time is if you can solve big problems. If not, I
Yeah.
think it's go big or go home, right?
Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. So tell us a little bit, tell me a little bit about how did Terrascope come about, and also what were some of the major takeaways for you as you exited that, like that you think are still areas of opportunity in that space?
Yeah. Terrascope was actually a journey of love. I'd been investing as an angel investor in the climate tech space for many years, for about 5 or 6 years. I'd become sort of this activist at heart, become an urban farmer. I was trying to grow sustainable produce, all triggered by, of course, tween at the time telling me, my daughter telling me, I'm not going to have a planet to live and nobody's going to solve it. And so this aspiration to say, okay, me growing plants and making one family sustainable is not going to solve the problem and the crisis we have. And so the idea behind Terrascope was to actually create a software platform that will help the largest of enterprises, which also end up being naturally the biggest emitters of carbon, to start thinking about how they transform their own supply chains, their own business, using AI, using machine learning to simulate what are the paths they could take. If you change suppliers, if you change ingredients, if you change the way you process something, how much is your carbon going to reduce? And so is it worth it? And then they could sort of overlay it with how much is it going to cost me to do it? Because that's also a practical consideration for companies. And so through this journey, I spent nearly 3 years building out the company with a global footprint. We started in Singapore, we added on Japan, the US, large markets where large multinationals with supply chains in the agri and food industry, which are big emitters, were placed and situated. And that was the journey of sort of trying to be able to collaborate with the big emitters and empower them with technology that could help tackle their needs. I think one of the interesting connection points to that was that it got me very inspired through, I sit on a number of boards globally. Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of joining a few boards and ending up being a sustainability committee chair or a sustainability voice on these boards to be able to then drive also that impact and that change through the board work that I do. And so in a way, I felt like every element of my life was really about taking and driving impact in this world. It's been interesting. I think the world of sustainability, and I stepped away from Terrascope end of last year as I took on more and more boards and wanted to spend a little bit more time driving impact through that. But the reality of what I see today is that there's a real fragmentation in point of view around, is sustainability a large challenge to solve or not? Is decarbonization a large problem to solve or not? And that's, it's a pity, but it's also, I look at it a little bit as a temporary blip. And the reason I say that is because neither is the weather challenges and the crisis letting up, nor is the world actually not heating up more and more and more. So the reality of what we have faced is not changing. And that reality kind of impacts at a very human level. So it's only a matter of time where if you don't solve some of these challenges, if you spend your July in Europe, you see this in a very real fashion, where the temperatures are in nearly 40 degrees Celsius. And it was never like this a decade ago, and people just don't have the infrastructure, the cooling to be able to cope. So if you don't do anything about it in a few years, you'll have a lot more civic unrest. You will have pushbacks against governments, etc. And so in a way, this world will come back and will have to fight this challenge. But the good thing is that you see that the continued push in the global south exists. You see Europe sort of thinking and continuing to commit in a way to this journey, not necessarily pulling back fully. But it's a little bit of a pity that perhaps North America and the US have sort of taken their foot off the pedal. I wouldn't underplay what is the impact of that, though, because the Wall Street is a big driver of checks and balances in the corporate world at large. Wall Street needs to care. And the minute
Yeah.
Wall Street cares, everybody else cares, right? Pragmatically, that's an important piece to keep in mind. So there is a need to kind of bring the American voice back.
Yeah, I think everyone's kind of holding their breath and being like it should happen. It should happen
Correct.
soon. I hope it does. But that's really interesting. I think that before I ask you a little bit more about your own leadership journey, and I will share some personal insights from seeing Maya, shine. I think that if we take a step back. Before that, you were at Twitter. Maya was heading up APAC, and of course, you had your own journey within Twitter. Twitter 1.0, I think we should say, just to clarify. But is there anything from that time? I mean, from running the team, also working in a matrix organization, but also working on social media at a time that it was a very exciting place. I think it's only the last couple of years we've started hearing more, from voices like Jonathan Haidt and others saying that you really need to examine the impact of social media, especially on mental health for young people, for example. And we of course got a sense of like how complicated it could be to work, in big tech, or the smallest of the big tech companies at that time. What are some of your takeaways from that period?
I think I'd say two or three key takeaways. One is that it was the first time on a personal level. It was the first time I was working in a company where I felt really I found home. And there was something amazing about trying to translate that into exactly what does that codify that into leadership kind of speak or insights. And actually, it is very much at the heart of a values driven company that was able to put its money where its mouth is, to stand for certain values and be consistent around those values. And it was, that was the joy of working in that environment. That was why it felt so much like home. And to find a tribe that all equally felt that feeling was really amazing, right? And then so you often describe leadership stories of having a common purpose and being pointing towards it, and I think that was where I viscerally felt it at first. And I think that was the most interesting part. The second part was, as a leader, it is always, I always say, all of us should experience at least one, if not multiple waves of being in the heart of absolute sort of successful journey of scaling. It's very addictive to be in that moment where you're in the right place, you're in the right moment. The actions that you take, you can see how that translates into growth of the business, growth of team, growth of impact the company has. So that's a very nice feeling. And I sort of feel like as a leader, I want to bottle that up and always remember that feeling. Being able to take the company in APAC from subscale to scale, being able to grow in complicated markets like China, being able to become of significant scale and impact in other countries that are somewhat smaller in Southeast Asia or India or Australia was amazing. So this was the joy of being that. I think the third takeaway I would have is that maybe the whole industry did not necessarily know or understand the unintended consequences that we would see at the tail end of some of our time there. And it is the pragmatic view that I have is that we should learn from it and we should take it and we should say, okay, if we now replayed the whole story as a social media industry overall, how could we do anything about unintended consequences? And I don't say that the unintended consequence is the only thing that existed in the end. There's always the good things and the tough things, but we did have some unintended consequences as an industry. So now when I kind of look at the wave that we're in now and we think about AI and what that is looking like, it would be such a waste if we didn't learn from the unintended consequences of what the social media wave looked like, right? And that is sort of my one big area that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how do you absolutely use AI? How do you, bottle all the goodness of it? But how do you put the guardrails and how do you actually think deeply and put enough investment and effort into security, privacy, educating people about how not to put all of their data into an LLM without thinking about what the consequences of that could be? And I think it's worth all of that effort to protect the well-being of humanity over time. Right. So that's three things from the Twitter journey that I took away. Some really lovely things and really good learning that I would not trade to be honest. That learning has been an amazing one on
Yeah.
unintended consequences.
No, 100%. And I think, yeah, I really hope. And I think, sort of anyone in policy or anyone who's watching or, working at these companies who are at the cutting edge of certainly Gen AI or AGI that's on the horizon would hope that, you'd be thinking about safety and privacy. And that's why some of those debates are so heated, I think, in terms of unintended consequences, is the best way of putting it. I also think that we love the product. This is a thing I was telling someone the other day. It's like it made so much sense to work there because we absolutely, I think we're all champions of
Yeah.
Twitter as a product, which of course has now changed. And no more on that for the moment. Let's see how that journey
Yeah, but
goes.
it's actually a good thing you bring up. I have, um, without knowing that that's what I was doing, over my career, I have always picked companies whose products I loved. But I only understood that that's what I was doing in retrospect, right? After I came to Twitter. But actually was a very early Twitter user. That made sense. I worked at Samsung before that, and I was a massive user of the Samsung phones from when it was S2, right? Like way back. Like I went from BlackBerry to Samsung. And before that, I used to be at Condé Nast, and I was a massive fan of Wired, which was a Condé Nast publication. So in a way, I think there is something about aligning very consciously your own energy and effort and the tremendous amount of time you spend in a career to things that you believe in, that you like, that you enjoy, because the magic is so much nicer and you can be so authentic saying that, being a spokesperson for the company.
Yeah.
Imagine being a spokesperson for a company and not really thinking that it's a great product,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of shitty. Sometimes you have to do those things, but kind of shitty when you have to do that. So
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, it's I think also like it's amazing if that can align, and if you can
right.
sort of find a way to monetize your the interest and passion and vision. So coming to your journey a little bit, I didn't know about Condé Nast actually. A
Yeah.
note to self to do better research next time. I had all the tech companies, I didn't think of the
Listen,
media
I
empire.
mentioned Wired, but also Condé
Yes.
Nast had a massive transformation on me. I went from Google to Condé Nast, and I was here, this technologist who walked into a world that, minus the negative parts of Devil Wears Prada, looked like a Devil
Yeah.
Wears Prada office, right?
Yeah.
And everybody brought their A game on everything they wore, and I had to quickly transform to fit in.
That's so interesting because I've been working. I mean, with this startup I had called Tap and Tribe, we've been talking to a lot of women who are senior execs, and this mid-career transition is a very tough one, right? So I actually came to Twitter from the media, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait, it was a very cool place to be in the sense that it's not like conservative corporate in that sense. But I still remember having a chat with you, having a chat with Jonathan Harley, my first manager, who was like, it's not the same. Your goalposts are not the same. Please understand, it's not because it's really like you have to adjust your entire perspective, right? So I do want to ask you, and I will share. I think Maya is one of the people I had a chance to chat with when I was still trying to, I think, find my feet, and then maybe a couple of years later when I'd started, performing pretty well, and I think maybe dealing with a little bit of imposter syndrome, though we didn't have the vocabulary there. And I was doing a Google Meet with you. I still remember from Singapore, and I was trying to get you to say, to support me in something, and you were like, articulate it, say it. You need to say that you deserve a promotion.
I
Just
do
say
that.
it, say the words out loud. And I was like, it's so hard. And you're like, if you don't say it, if you don't articulate it, and ever since I've been thinking it's such a great lesson to learn from you, because absolutely the same way we talk to maybe younger women now and say that if you don't articulate your ambition, if you don't say you deserve a raise or you deserve a promotion, you're not going to get it. No one's psychic. And of course, there were like, the processes we had to follow. But I still remember that conversation. I'm like, wow. And you did it very kindly, but you were very firm. You're like, if you can't say it to me, you're not going to be able to. So coming to the leadership part of it, because, you've also obviously you've been an engineer, you've been in product, you've been a technologist, and then you come to like managing huge teams in a matrix organization. It's pretty complicated. We also lived through the pandemic. It's a very difficult time for a lot of people. How did you find sort of this resilience? Who did you look up to? How did you come upon your own sort of leadership philosophy? Like, how did you decide the leader you want to be in that? And then we'll come to in startups as well.
Yeah, I think the part about finding people that I could look up to and idolize was a little bit hard for me. Not that there aren't good people, there are always good people, but I think at first in my career, as I was a early leader, I sort of imagined there was this one or two people that embodied everything that I would respect and look up to. And I think the learning for me was that I had to piecemeal it a bit, right? I drew inspiration from someone about the way they were able to articulate vision. I drew inspiration from someone else on how they were actually able to embrace kind of the people side of the equation. And so I didn't easily find this one person that I could kind of look up to. And when people would ask me, I would say, honestly, at the time, I used to look up to Bill Gates a lot. I used to look up to the Obamas a lot. And it felt, it felt a little bit, as if I was avoiding the question and not really putting a more relatable face or name to it. But over time, that's what I realized. I took inspiration from conversations, particularly good, deep conversations of people who were able to intervene and tell me something was amazing. I have to tell you a story of when I started my board journey. We had a fellow leader and colleague in the company at Twitter called Eliza. And Eliza actually told me, I'm happy to share my board bio with you. Take it, use it. Like, this is the journey. This is how you're going to do it. And it's those moments of when you look to someone for inspiration and they're like, okay, here, I'm going to sit you down. I'm going to tell you what to do. It's really interesting. And that makes those moments also make you a little bit closer to be able to be vulnerable and ask for other things. There were these other moments where, now I have to tell you, I got a few tattoos, right? So I got one of these, right? I got a tattoo, and then like half an hour after getting the tattoo, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know if this is going to impact my career. Like, I
But
have,
please show it again. It's a gorgeous one. I love this one. Yes.
yeah, this is my nod to Indian tribal jewelry and kind of tattooing around that. Um, but I was really like, after getting the tattoo for half a day, I was sweating it, saying, I don't know if this is going to impact my career, etc., etc. So I meet my then boss at Twitter, who was Shailesh Rao, and he looks at me and says, "Tech executive, you got a tattoo? Good. Now you're well set for your career." It's just, it's amazing in those moments of
Yes.
of doubt, and you just have the right people around you who know to set you right, and you're like, okay, let's get past all this. Let's talk about leadership. Let's talk about what we need to do. So it's been really nice to work with high quality people to have deep conversations. But I think to come to a little bit more of the meaty part of what you asked, which is, what is the leadership style and who did I borrow from, or how did I construct it for myself? I think that the part about leadership that I think about is that I love to be able to be inspirational to people and have tall, ambitious vision for companies that I'm a part of. But at the same time, the person that I am actually someone that needs to feel a connection with people I work with in a way as if there isn't a power distance. And that just is how I feel comfortable, right? It took me a long time to realize that I need to find this combination that works for me. And often I would look at other leaders in my early leadership career part, and I would say, man, all these other people have this huge reverence towards these other leaders, and I don't really perceive the reverence towards me. And I realized even if I got the reverence, I wouldn't feel comfortable in my own skin. That's just not me. And there are pros and cons to each, right? You have to take what you get. And I had an amazing executive coach when I took on the Asia Pacific leadership at Twitter. Her name is Irina Mew. So she was absolutely incredible in helping me unpack kind of what is personal to me, what will work for me. So take these pieces that I like from different people. How do I articulate vision in a way that will appeal to many people at large, at scale? What kind of stories do I like to tell? What are my equivalent of sports analogies that you see typical tech bros, kind of laying out? But I didn't know what my analogies were. And I'm like, if I talk about me as a gardener, that kind of could fall flat sometimes, right? Compared to the big, like, sporty. But I found my way to talk about my own self, my own interests, my family, me being a mother, using my stories that are personal to me to drive the connection to the vision. Took me a while to get there. And then never losing my relatability to people at a regular day-to-day level. So that was my journey in a way, picking and choosing from the people I
Yeah.
worked with, and thanks to an amazing executive coach who set me right.
It's so interesting because I think it's also because you don't have, like, when they say you can't be what you can't see, like, you have not also the generation above, and we're the same generation. I should add quickly, but I should say that when you look at leaders, there, you were the first, I think, I think you're the first, let's say at least woman in leadership, like to leading APAC, let alone the other identities and stuff. The other thing I find fascinating is, we're now seeing, and I've been looking because of, the work in the mental health space. And then at Twitter, there were people who were like, just be your whole self. And you were one of them. I remember you being very pragmatic. And I feel like that's something I also realized, that you can be accessible, have the conversations, not get swayed by every single person because there's so many emotions constantly. But, it was, for me, this aha moment was on a panel when I actually was moderating with Sanjeev Bikhchandani and Mr. Damodharan. I was going through the research and I was like, oh, Mr. Bikhchandani, you said you guys never actually did layoffs and this is from the first .com, bust that you were talking about. And I said, that's insane. Like you haven't ever done, and that shows such empathy. And, of course I was like, this is amazing. And he was so matter of fact about it. He was like, you don't get to be that empathetic leader unless you're successful. If you're not, running a profitable business. So let's not forget the basics. And I think it's interesting because you do have to look at results. You do have to be, looking at the bottom line while doing all the other things that you juggle. And the rest of it, as you said, is your own personal journey, right? Like you figure out what kind of leader you want to be. How different is it when you're in startup mode versus running like huge, as you said, operations in a big company?
Yeah. I think the big question is, can a large company person also be successful in a startup mode, right? And I didn't know the answer to that until I went to Terrascope, and being among the first three people that actually got together and started the company was an amazing journey. But you don't have an army of hundreds of people around you, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it goes back to, what is it that you really want out of your job? And there's a lot of things that normally can answer that question. A lot of it is identity. Some of it is kind of the experience that you actually have running the job. The third part is actually the impact you want to have. The fourth part is there are other things that you get from it, just the benefits of having a large team, how you get perceived, how you get treated in society, things like that, right? So there's all these elements to it. I always tell people, you have to ask yourself the question, can you transcend both? And there are people who do it all the time, so it's not impossible. But you may have a certain type and you may enjoy a certain type, right? So that was the first thing. I think the piece that you talk about is performance, and successful performance is very, very important. Ultimately, if you think about, companies are here to serve stakeholders, whether that's a customer, whether that's an employee. You can only continue to keep doing it if you have resources, if you can make it durable, if you correct the mistakes you might have made along the path and actually get to a better place. So I think that is a very real part of the equation. There are many times in my career, across at least 3 or 4 companies, where you do have to make trade-offs. And so you end up having to do layoffs or things that in your heart, you never want to do it as a human being. It's hard. It's emotionally really traumatic. But the pragmatic side of it is, you have no choice, right? Do you continue operating and building businesses successfully, or do you not? But I think it's the how you operate that becomes very important, because the what can sometimes be phenomenal and good and great stories, or it could be tough times, but the how you operate should be really consistent. And so I always test and see, if I've had to part ways with people in teams and done it, will these people ever come back and work with me in another company? That's a litmus test as a leader that I ask myself. Not that I want to keep, parting ways with people, but if that happens, the how you do it has to be humane. The how you do it has to be very clear. It has to be not personal. And then you have a chance of sort of saying, okay, it didn't quite work out in that company, but in another scenario, would we work together again? Right? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. But the good things about being in a small company and a startup environment, you make decisions very quickly. If you think you have authority as the APAC leader for Twitter, you have so much more empowerment, not because there was lack of empowerment there, but just because of the size, right, of a company. And that's quite thrilling. Very often, if you see people who are entrepreneurial and work in smaller companies, they struggle to go back to a large company environment, because it's addictive that you can make decisions, you can move, you can experiment very quickly. So I feel like I've had the privilege of seeing both sides. And as a board director, it's an even third vantage point, where you are not operating, you are not the CEO, but you are able to influence strategy of very, very large companies globally. So I
You
feel very privileged to have those 3 vantage points.
I'm amazed that you even have any free time for yourself for your urban farming. But let me ask you then, so did you know this about yourself? And can you tell us a little bit about how the board, you were saying earlier that that exposure helped you think through what you want to do next. Did you always know you have an entrepreneurial side? And you did mention that, in the beginning of this chat, that even 8 years ago, you were thinking about what's now Genie. The timing wasn't right. You had that sense that you might want to do your own thing. And how did this end up happening?
I've been an entrepreneur before. I started an e-commerce company in India, very early days of e-commerce, and actually didn't do well with it back then, right? So it's have the scars from it, but also the joy of designing a platform and a product that was amazing. So I felt like and even while I was at MBA school at INSEAD, I actually majored in entrepreneurship. So I think I had this clue that I loved fast-paced growth environments, and very often that's kind of equated to entrepreneurship. So it's also in a way why Twitter was so fun. Because if you think about the early days of Twitter when I took over the region, it was still very small markets, very small teams, still figuring out what is the strategy in every region. So I think if you decode what I really enjoy and where I'm good at as a leader, it's in being able to tackle growth and hypergrowth and being able to do that well, being able to hire good people, bring them to the mix. So I think I've had a clue that I've really enjoyed entrepreneurial environments. But I think when I started to think about board journeys, the voice that I carry on the board often tends to be that of a technologist, that of an innovator, that of someone who embraces growth. So that's where the entrepreneurial mindset also translates into some of the board work that I do, even though the nature of the work is very different.
And you're on the board, for example, of Cipla. There's some huge companies. Just a couple more questions for you, Maya. Right now, when you're looking at, as we were joking earlier, like big problems, go big or go home, you're obviously optimizing for impact. How do you look at success and failure now, today, versus, maybe midway through your career or even 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think 10 years ago, I would say my definition of success was very, very the traditional definition of success. What is my title? I always say, do you want the title more? Do you want money more? Do you want, kind of size of team more? You have to be very clear what you think is success. And in my case, it was, what's the title? The scope of impact that I'm able to have, and am I doing well in that or not? So I think that was very much the traditional approach to definition of success. I think what I feel now is, and especially with the experience of running Terrascope the last 3 years, and then being able to take on kind of the board work as well as kind of co-founding Genie, there are some problems that are difficult problems, but worthy problems to solve. There's not many people in the world who would be able to solve this really well. And I don't know if I can or cannot solve these, but this is time well spent in my life, right? If I can get somewhat closer, if I can get a coalition of minds to be able to solve some of these big problems, if I can influence a generation of team members to think about this and go away and then maybe work at other companies and kind of lay seeds, that feels like success to me. A little bit of my leadership mantra has really been tightly coupled to purpose meets profit, right? And I think a lot about how I want to be ambitious about both of those things. I don't want to trade off either of them, and I'm quite stubborn about it. So as I think about what's ahead as we're incubating the venture with Genie, I think about wanting consumers to have their own data at their fingertips. I want them to be able to feel completely in control of all of their information. I want them to not have confusion of, is it this or that? Or this doctor told me that doctor told me something else. I'm taking 100 supplements. I don't know what works and what doesn't work for me. These are all problems we're itching to solve at Genie. And it'll take time to solve these one by one, but that's the hope and that's the
That's
journey. And if you
incredible.
can empower consumers to feel comfortable going through that journey, you feel like you've added some value to people's
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah, that's incredible. Especially when most of us are getting our tips and advice on Instagram now. Oh, wait. As soon as you listen to one topic, you're like inundated, right? Like it's the way the algo is
Yeah.
favoring us. It would be good to have. No, so watching and cheering you on, Maya, I could chat with you forever, but I will have to keep an eye on your time, considering all that you do. Last question for the moment. What is something that you're grateful for that you'd be comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I'm actually incredibly grateful for just the journey that I have had. I think every conversation with people, every team I've led, every job I've had has actually broadened my own perspective to redefine what I mean by global or what I mean by impact. And I don't think I can do any of what I do today if I'm a sum total of all the experiences I've had. So I genuinely feel very grateful for, having the experiences I've had and working.
I love that. Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you for taking out the time. Thanks for being the leader you are and for the impact you're hoping to achieve. I think it's incredible. Thanks so much.